Welcome to the Remembering a Life podcast. I'm your host, Holly Ignatowski, and today we're talking with Bryant Hightower, a funeral director at Martin Hightower Funeral Home in Carrollton, Georgia. Following the 9/11 terrorist attacks, Bryant traveled to New York City to assist with reaching out to the families of the people who were killed. Welcome, Bryant, and thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Holly, for having me. It's my pleasure.
Hard to believe it's been 20 years since that terrible, terrible day. Can you please tell us about the morning of September 11th? I know we all pretty much remember exactly what we were doing and where we were. How did your day begin?
Yeah, Holly, I do remember it pretty vividly. It started just like any other day. My children were small, and part of our morning routine was for me to get them ferried off to school while the wife straightened up by the house behind us before heading off to work herself. So I had delivered the kids to school and was at the office. We have a television in the office, and oftentimes we'd gather the morning news, and it might stay on for a little while. And we were all in the office and heard of some things going on. Somebody got a text from someone, I think, reporting something. So we flipped the TV on, and we're actually watching the TV when the second plane hit the World Trade.
Tell us about the rest of your day. You're watching this unfold. You see it happen. What is going through your mind at this time?
You know, just the horrific loss of life. I mean, as you could see those buildings tumble to the ground, you knew that there had been a tremendous loss of life and such a senseless act. And with the attack taking place not only in New York but in Washington and in Pennsylvania as well, you just really felt for the families of those who had lost their lives and really just reflected on the loss of life that we had all seen unfold in front of our eyes, and it was just a tragedy. So it really clouded the rest of our day. I'd been a part of Dmort for some time when that occurred and realized that there might be the potential for a Dmort deployment as a result of the attacks, but just kind of waited on that to unfold. But the rest of the day was just very surreal as I remember it.
You just mentioned Dmort. Could you please explain what that is and the role that they play in tragedies like this?
Sure. The acronym Dmort stands for Disaster Mortuary Operational Response Team, and it's a federal entity that came about some 25 or so years ago, I would suspect, that has the capability of assisting local assets in time of disaster. They have the ability to set up a temporary morgue, operate family assistance centers, and it's a multifaceted team, and it is really a team approach made up not only of funeral directors and embalmers, but forensic anthropologists, pathologists, forensic odontologists, radiologists. So it really brings to bear a lot of different specialties to augment the ability of an individual jurisdiction to respond in times of mass fatality events. And I'd been a part of Dmort, I guess, for 4 or 5 years, maybe or so, by the time 9/11 hit.
So you arrived in New York City 2 days later on September 13th. What was your specific role in New York City?
It changed over time because I was there off and on for the better part of about 3 months. My time there lasted well beyond Thanksgiving. Originally, I was in what's called a family assistance center. As you know, a lot of the people who were involved, especially those who were passengers on those planes, their families were spread all across the country. And part of our initial job, or my job, along with other members of my team and some volunteers from the state of New York, was to contact those families of those passengers to kind of answer questions they might have had about what was going on the ground, because as you can imagine, they had a lot of questions about the process, what was going on. They were seeing things on the news, but they weren't being given individual information. And so we were kind of a conduit, if you will, for them for information on the ground. If they had questions, we tried to get them answers. We also tried to elicit some information from them, not knowing what the recovery efforts might look like and our ability to eventually be able to return remains back to their families. So we were gathering some ante-mortem information from those families as a part of our interaction with them. That was initially my job, and then later on I worked at the medical examiner's office with a team of detectives. Also was positioned at the temporary morgue down at Ground Zero for a time. So I worked in several different areas over the 2 or 3 months that I was there.
You're used to dealing with loss pretty much every day, but on a much smaller scale. How did you help these families that have experienced this loss, this terrible loss? How were you able to have these difficult conversations day after day after day?
You know, you're right. We do deal with death on a daily basis, and I think that did prepare us to have these conversations. We have these conversations on a daily basis, but we generally don't go from one conversation to another conversation to another conversation. I mean, we were literally talking to, a dozen families a day, and just, again, trying to offer them information, trying to offer them answers to questions that they might have had, and offering them, in some instances, some hope. We certainly didn't know what the recovery efforts might look like early on. We didn't know what the ability to return those remains would be, and it was evident very early on that that's what they wanted. They knew the loss of life that had taken place, but they very desperately wanted something to be returned. And in some instances, that was possible. In other instances, it may not have been possible, but they very much wanted that in order to move forward. And that became evident because it wasn't a one-time conversation we'd have with these families. There was one lady who I had a conversation with who, and if you don't mind, I'll tell you a little of this story. I think it kind of points to some of what they were going through. There was a lady that I talked to in one of my first conversations, and she was feeling very guilty. And the reason for her guilt was she had a daughter who was on the West Coast who was getting married. And she and her husband had agreed that they could only afford for one of them to make the trip to California. So the husband had bought a little video camera and told his wife, look, you go. She wants you there. You need to be there as the mom of the bride. You go, record the event, come back, and you and I'll share it. Well, as time went on, she began to feel very guilty about his inability to attend the wedding. And she cleared the attic, had some yard sales, raised the funds, and bought him a ticket unbeknownst to him. She made a gift of that to him, and he was in the second plane to hit World Trade. She felt very guilty because had she left well enough alone, he would not have been on that plane. And so she was dealing with a lot of guilt and angst in some of my first conversations. In some subsequent conversations, she had come to some realization. She had dealt with her grief as best she could, and she had come to the realization, and these are her words, I'll paraphrase as I remember them, that she had come to the realization that God didn't take things from you without giving you a gift in return. And I just thought that insight was amazing to have gone through what she had gone through and come out with that kind of revelation. So I'm pulling into work some probably 4 or 5 months later, and I remember this like it was yesterday. She had my cell phone number because if you heard something on the news and you weren't sure if it was true, we tried to give them a way of contacting us so that we could get them accurate information. So my phone rings one morning as I'm pulling into office. I've been back from New York now for several months, and I answered the phone, and she said, is this Bryant? And I said, yes, it is. And she gave me her name. And I said, yes, ma'am, how are you doing? And she said, I'm doing really well. And she said, I want to remind you of a conversation that we had. And I said, okay. She said, do you remember me telling you that I came to the realization that, God didn't take things from us without giving us a gift in return? And I said, yes, ma'am. And I remember how awestruck I was by that comment. And she said, well, I've gotten my gift. And I said, you have? What is it? And she said, I got a call yesterday from my daughter in California, the one that got married. And I said, yes, ma'am. She said she's having twins. And I said, really? And so those are the kinds of relationships. I had a couple of other people who I stayed in contact with for a few months after leaving New York. So that was the kind of relationships you were able to build over the phone. And I've wished so often that I could have reached out and hugged them. I've wished that I could have sat down with them over their kitchen table and shared a cup of coffee. But they really needed somebody to talk to who could offer them accurate information and who just kind of understood the parameters of what they were trying to deal with. And I think we were able to fill part of that role for them. And I've wondered so often how they've continued to deal with that horrific loss.
That's amazing and clearly very powerful. It stayed with you all these years. The entire country was mourning this terrible tragedy, and it had to be daunting even for a seasoned professional like yourself. How did you cope with the loss? Who was there for you?
There was a psychologist as a part of our Dmort team, so we were able to be debriefed. And sometimes you just felt like you needed to talk to somebody to unload, and so he was always available for us, and he moved around throughout the team. And if he saw you, saw that glazed look in your eye. Sometimes he'd pull you aside and he'd say, let's go share a cup of coffee. Let's talk a little bit. So that was always available to us. You know, the toughest part, I think, of going through this grief with these families was that when we do it on a daily basis at home, we're able to go home to our families at night and kind of regenerate ourselves and kind of rejuvenate our ability to go forward tomorrow. We were estranged from our families for that length of time. They were back home with some idea of what we were dealing with, but really probably not really to the extent that we were dealing with it, did they have any idea what was going on. So anyway, I think that's the part I missed. We were able to share with each other. We were all going through the same thing as members of the Dmort team and other responders. I bonded with several New York detectives who I worked side by side with for almost a month in the medical examiner's office. So we were able to share as well. But you did miss the contact to your family and the ability to share with them to some degree what your day had been like. I talked to my wife just about every day while we were there, and, you know, you didn't want to load her up with all this stuff, so you didn't want to burden her with it, but she was always there for me to talk to as well, and sometimes she could tell in my voice what was going on, and so, you know, she'd kind of drag it out of me a little bit, so it kind of helped to get rid of that, but you knew you were there to do a job, and that you knew the job was more important than your own feelings, and so, you know, we just went about every day trying to do the best job we could.
You shared one story with us. Are there other families or memories that really stick with you?
There is. There's another story. The antemortem information that we gather, Dmort uses a computer program that takes all the antemortem information that we gather, and then when there is a recovery made, there's a postmortem inventory made as well, and it's things like hair color, any visible tattoos or scars, jewelry, those kinds of questions that are asked, eye color, those kinds of things. And hopefully what you're trying to do is as a recovery is made, you begin to narrow the scope so that you're able to return this person's loved one back into their care. And in one of the early conversations I had, there was a lady who I talked to, and her husband's wedding band had a specific inscription in it. And I've logged that into my antemortem information sheet, and then I got transferred down to the ME's office. And our job, along with those detectives, was to take all this information that was gathered on the antemortem side, it had been put into the computer, and take some of the postmortem information that was being gathered at the ME's office and try to find matches so that they could begin to do more in-depth study to do a positive ID. And I had a file in front of me trying to put this information in, and I happened to notice one of the things that was logged as personal effects was this ring, and the inscription was in the description phase of the ring, and it joggled something. So I was able to go back, and I had done the initial interview with this lady and logged in that information and was able to be the one that found the file. And so there were remains that we were ultimately able, the ME's office was able to positively identify, and we were able to return her husband's remains to her and her small child. And that just gave me such a feeling of accomplishment, because there were so many families we weren't able to do that for. But in this specific case, we were able to help this lady find, you know, a new journey in her grief experience, because she was able to put her husband to rest.
To give her that very important closure.
Absolutely.
That is amazing, yeah. Is there anything else you'd like to share, or anything else you'd like us to know about that time in our history?
You know, I think the members of Dmort and the other responders to that mass fatality event probably are the unsung heroes of 9/11. Certainly the MOS, the members of service, the fire department, and the police department that were down there at Ground Zero doing the recovery deserve every bit of credit they can be given. But there were volunteers from the New York State Funeral Directors Association, the Metropolitan Funeral Directors Association, and certainly members of Dmort that were on the ground every day trying to help families and help those other first responders through this event. And my hat just goes off to them, because there were folks there that stayed there long after I left that continued to do that work. And, you know, without them, I think it would have been a much more daunting task for all of those folks in New York City. The ME's office did a phenomenal job. They have tremendous resources, but I think the things that Dmort were able to bring to bear made their job somewhat easier, and probably was able to allow them to continue to do some of the other work they needed to do. I mean, just because of 9/11, the other instances in and around New York didn't stop happening. There certainly was, a curtailing of some of the more violent crimes there for a time, but you still had natural deaths occurring. You still had, homicides. You still had suicides. You still had some of those things that an ME's office deals with on a daily basis. So not only were they dealing with the effects of the 9/11 events, but they were still dealing with everything that they dealt with on a daily basis. So, I think we were able to take some of the pressure off of them. And so my hat, again, just goes off to all those people that were there.
Life does go on, yeah.
It did.
Bryant, I ask all of my guests, who are you remembering today?
My thoughts are with all those families who lost loved ones on that tragic day. Having talked to so many of them, I could feel their pain come through the phone. I know that there's not been a day that's gone by that they haven't relived that loss. And I know on this special anniversary, the loss will seem even more real. So my thoughts, prayers are with all of those families today.
Thank you for joining me today, Bryant, and for sharing those very difficult stories. We so appreciate the work that you do, the compassion that you show in your work. It's very important every day to serve grieving families.
Well, thank you. It's been my pleasure to join you.
And thank you for joining me today. To share your own memories and reflections about the terrorist attacks on September 11th, 2001, visit rememberingalife.com/share your story.